We've been hearing a lot about VPAT, and in this episode, we're going to talk about how to understand what VPAT is and what it's used for and how is it important for accessibility. VPAT stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. What is a VPAT? A VPAT helps others understand how accessible your product or service is for people with disabilities. How is this different from an ACR or Accessibility Conformance Report? The VPAT is a template. It is used to draft your ACR or Accessibility Conformance Report. The ACR will state what accessibility standards your digital property meets, and it lets users know about any accessibility blockers that may be found. It is essentially a snapshot of your digital property's accessibility conformance at a point in time. Sometimes the term VPAT is used interchangeably to refer both to the template but also to the ACR. So sometimes people use the term VPAT when they really mean ACR, but the VPAT itself is the generic document template that is used by companies as a guide to drafting their product's ACR. And ultimately, this ACR, a filled out VPAT, will give potential customers a sense of the impact your product or service will have on those with disabilities. What is important to include in your ACR? It is important to include your digital properties details. That includes the description of the property, what version of it you are evaluating, the date, and the scope, and what criteria or standard should be outlined as to which was chosen for this particular ACR, which VPAT template are you using. And then within that, you need to make note of the conformance level of your digital property with the criteria that you have chosen to evaluate your digital property against. And then finally, remarks are areas where you provide an explanation of why that conformance level is what you stated. And if it is not up to par, you may want to show your commitment to improve on that conformance level with your product. What are the conformance levels that you can actually state in your ACR? You can say that your digital property fully supports that criteria. You can say that it partially supports that criteria. You can say that it does not support that criteria. You can say that criteria is not applicable. This can occur, for example, there are several criteria that in the WCAG that refer to the use of media. But if your digital property, like a website, for example, does not have any video or audio media, then some of the criteria that has to do with making sure your media has transcription or your video has closed captioning or even audio description, that would not be applicable in this situation because you do not have that kind of media on your website. And the fifth, which will only ever be used sparingly, is that it wasn't evaluated. So you did not evaluate your digital property against that criteria. And this can only really be used in reference to a WCAG, whether 2.0, 2.1, or 2.2 level AAA criteria. Again, most standards do not require you to go all the way to level. An example of this would be color contrast, where currently most standards that we use are the double A or level A standard, where you want to have a color contrast level of 4.5 to 1. The more strict criteria of having a color contrast level of 7 to 1 is an AA criteria, and most people are not expected to meet this criteria. So you can effectively say you did not evaluate it against that stricter criteria because it's no laws out there actually require it. Another example would be with media, the use of audio description. Again, this is considered a level AAA criteria for videos, that you would have audio description added to your videos. Netflix, when it was sued several years back for accessibility, actually went all the way to provide audio description. So if you stream any sort of TV or movie property on Netflix that has audio description, you will have the ability to turn that on as a level criteria, but it is not required. Netflix went all the way once it lost that lawsuit to make sure that it was not just meeting the standard, but went above the standard. And it's generally rare to reach 100% support when you're discussing conformance levels with the various criteria. Why are ACRs even needed? Section 508 requires that all communications technology that is developed, procured, maintained, or used by the federal government has to meet certain accessibility standards. So when this requirement was initiated, the Information Technology Industry Council, or ITI, and the U.S. General Services Administration, the GS, created the VPAT so that vendors could easily furnish the supporting documentation for their product to the government, and it would be easy to assess whether that product met the accessibility standards of the government. So it was meant to be basically to help people present their material in a templated way so that's easy for government workers who are in charge of developing, procuring, or maintaining or using technology to assess whether the government should be involved with using this technology. And it was in 2017 that the template was based specifically on the WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And there are different versions of the WCAG because there are different levels that need to be met depending on what you're trying to do. So currently the highest version is 2.2, but we also have 2.1 and 2.0. And again, we have different standards within that, the A, AA, and AAA standards. So that's just to say that there are actually multiple templates. So there is not one single VPAT template that you will be able to find out there. There are unique VPATs depending on what standard you are going to use to evaluate your product. So there are templates for the WCAG, and they're for the different levels of WCAG, whether 2.0, 2.1, AA, single A, whatever. But there's also a specific template for Section 508, and there's also a specific template to use if you are trying to conform with the European Union's EN 301549 standard. And no matter what template you're using, the purpose of the VPAT remains the same: to document the accessibility of the digital property, no matter which standard is followed. The VPAT has become a quick screening tool to check the accessibility of a product or service with similar offerings from other vendors. And we can take a look at the ITIC website to get samples of those templates as well as additional training. So they update these templates periodically. So if you are asked to do a VPAT or ACR right now, but you've done it a couple years back, you do want to go back to the website and check if there's been any updates to the template itself. So download a new template every time you're going to do this. So you would want to go to the website and check if they've updated the template. And this is what you would find on the ITI website, where you have these different that you can download. This is the one for the EU, or the European Union. This INT is like international, because sometimes different countries have different standards. So it has a mix of WCAG criteria. There's the Section 508 template, and there's the generic WCAG template. And then there's also a document that talks about change tracking. So how has the template changed over time? And you can see right here what is the last date that these templates were updated. And you can see the last date was November 1st, 2023. And these are free. You don't have to pay for these templates. They're provided. And again, they are just here to make the job easier when you're trying to submit an ACR when it's requested of you. Typically, this will happen if you're trying to apply for a government contract, and you may be seeing more of this because of the Section 504 update regulations for health and education. So if you're going to do contracts with higher education in the United States or with health organizations, they will also probably be requesting that you submit an ACR, and you're going to need to go download the appropriate template and then fill it out and build your ACR using this standard. And then what's also nice about the VPAT, the ITAG website with regards to VPAT, is there are several trainings that they provide. So even if absolutely nothing about accessibility and you are asked to provide this and you don't know where to start, it doesn't matter, because you can go to the same website that has templates. They also provide basic training on how to do this now that you've downloaded the template itself. So we can take, again, another look at some of this. So they will provide, there's 8 different modules of training that you can download directly from the website. And it really outlines things in a very clear, I would say, way, having looked through it, where they go step by step, introduction, and they tell you what is VPAT, what's the difference between ACR, which we just went over, why did this happen, and so we talked about that as well. And then it explains you're being asked to give answers to, is your product accessible? And again, so ACR is not a sort of certification. It's a good thing to point out. It's a statement of conformance. So it's saying that your product conforms with this criteria, but it's not any sort of particular certification. Who completes VPATs? People that do business with U.S. federal government agencies, like we just talked about. But you're going to see this more and more in the private sector. Right now, this year, Title II guidelines were increased, were re-released with updates where WCAG 2.1 AA standard is expected for state and local governments. And like I said, the whole 4 guidelines were updated for health organizations and higher education. Once we get to Title III, which is all businesses of public accommodation, then pretty much everybody is going to require you to provide a VPAT ACR for your product to show that it's accessible. And so these are, again, the people we've talked about who is consuming these ACRs, and we've talked about the government, corporations, consumers, and education. So I think they did a really good job with their training. So if you don't have any idea about accessibility, and then you're told you need to fill this out, they do have pretty good basic training on what you need to do to submit back to them the proper ACR. And then there's always, all of the documents will have phone numbers and email for you to ask your questions. They also have trainings that go specific to each guideline. So there's a whole presentation about what is WCAG, what are these levels. I've been talking to you, you haven't understood what I was talking about. This actually goes into the history of WCAG, the POUR principles, things we've talked about in the past with other sessions. This is a pretty good base summary of what you need to know. And then it also talks about Section 508, which is specific to the federal government. If you're wanting to be a government contractor, what are the things that you need to provide to the government for them to even consider partnering with you and using your product? And then there is the EN 301549. Most people have probably been not that familiar with the EN 301549, which is a European standard, but because they just passed the European Accessibility Act, and most people who do business with the EU will be required to conform to the EU's standards by July of 2025. Most people are going to become more familiar with what EN 301549 is, and ITI provides simple kind of training and information about that. And then the Module 6 goes over how to make a good ACR. We'll also talk a little bit about this. And then what's that? You've filled it out. What do you do with it now? And so they explain how your ACR itself should be accessible. You could be submitting it to someone because you've been asked by someone to provide it, but you can also make it, once you do this, you can make it downloadable and viewable from your website. You can make it something you email to people when they ask you, hey, I'm thinking of using your product with my company. Is it accessible? Then you can email them this ACR that you just developed to the person that's asking a question. And then the final module is about people who are actually reading the ACRs and evaluating the ACRs for them to figure out, is this done well, this ACR that had just been submitted for me? The thing is that they'll be looking for is, did you guys check your product against the correct standard for us? What template are you using? What is going on with the different editions and how things change? Is it correct? They may say, hey, you didn't check it against the right criteria. You did this a few years ago and we need something that's updated. So you want to do version tracking with your ACR, date it, and then say it's the first time, 1.0, that we've tried to do this. Maybe a couple years from now, you release an update, 2.0 or whatever. So I think the ITI website does provide a lot of additional information if you're confused about the ACR, confused about VPAT. So they not only provide the templates, they provide training. So how do you plan for an audit and submitting an accessibility conformance report? The first thing you have to consider is, what is your market? What standard do you need to evaluate your product or service against? Is it WCAG? Is it Section 508? Is it EN 301549? And if you decide it's WCAG, which criteria of WCAG are you looking to conform to? Are you looking to conform to 2.0, 2.1, or 2.2, the latest? And within that, do you need to have level A conformance, level AA conformance, or level AAA conformance, which pretty much nobody is required at this point to have AAA performance. But that doesn't stop you from trying. So if you want to go above the standard, that's always your choice. And I'm sure people with disabilities would be happy if companies went above the required standard. And once you do these two things, like figure out what is the relevant standard, what are the criteria, then you also have to think about, for example, on your website, what are the critical tasks that a user must complete? Is it purchasing a product? Is it downloading something? Is it just getting to certain types of information? Is it filling out a form? What is the critical task? What is the call to action on your website or the page that you're evaluating? And once you identify that, you have to make sure that task is something a user with a disability or someone who's using assistive technology can complete. Because when it comes down to accessibility lawsuits and things like that, typically it's maybe you don't have the quite right color contrast, or you're like 0.1 off with your contrast. Those are not the things that are going to get you as much in trouble. What's going to get you in trouble is if someone needs to buy something from your website and they can't do it because your payment gateway is not accessible. They can't fill out your form because the entry fields of your form aren't labeled properly, and they have no idea what information you need. Like, where do you put your credit card information? Where do you put your name and your address? These are the things that you have to think about. What are the critical tasks? Because being unable to complete a critical task is what's going to get you in trouble when someone with a disability is on your website. Is your website keyboard navigable? And sometimes my focus has always been on making sure the code is correct, but there's the extra step of user testing that you have to think about. Get someone who is going to be the user on your site, someone who's blind, who has familiarity with using screen readers and is trying to navigate your site for a screen reader. Do user testing with that person. Can they finish the task? If they can't finish the task, that's important for you to know. That's important for you to address in your ACR. Figure out which pages on your site have the most traffic, because that way you can figure out where you need to focus your attention on making sure those pages specifically are in conformance. And then what's your deadline? Are you being asked to provide this now because you're applying for a government contract? Is it something that you're just doing because you want to do a better job for people with disabilities and you're trying to fix things? So there's really no particular timeline. Is it because you've been sued and you're being asked to provide information about what's going on your website? Do you have time to remediate? Because that's going to affect how quickly you can do this, how detailed, like what time do you have to go back and fix things before? So if you're trying to apply for a government contract, but that contract, that application isn't due for several months, you choose to start to look at your website now. You identify problems. You can probably fix those problems before you actually need to submit your application. And in your ACR that you submit when you apply to be a vendor, you can actually say, hey, I conform with this criteria now. And it gives your application a boost. How do ACRs improve accessibility? ACRs help with transparency, consistency, and accuracy. An accurate ACR can not only show the accessibility of your product, service, website, or other digital property, is a tool for finding where your current offering may be falling short. So by taking the time to do assessments on a regular basis, to audit your site, to fill out these ACRs on a regular basis using the right template, you can actually work towards really getting your product up to speed with these guidelines. And if you were completely unaware that you failed in all these things, then you're not going to do anything about it because you didn't know about it. But once you start looking and you realize where you're failing, you can actually be proactive to fix those things before you have to apply for that big contract, or, you know, before you get a demand letter saying that you're not doing right by someone with a disability, or worse, that you're now have a lawsuit because someone really needed to complete a critical task on your website and they were unable to. So who can create an ACR from a VPAT? Ultimately, anyone can write an ACR. You're if you're not in a company and you're trying to apply for a government contract, become a vendor of your product to some sort of federal agency, you as the owner can fill it out. You don't have to hire a third party or impartial third party to fill it out, to do an audit or produce your report at this time. There are some, we talked about our legal update, there are some state laws out there that are possibly looking to make ACRs a requirement, but right now there is no requirement to hire an impartial third party to do the audit and fill out the ACR. Anyone can do it. You can do it. However, if you don't have the experience as a dedicated accessibility specialist, or you don't really have the training or the knowledge, then it's probably unlikely that you can fill all this out without any knowledge. You're going to not be able to fill out an accurate ACR. So we were talking about an accurate ACR. So while there is training out there, you will have to do a lot of education for yourself. If not, absolutely nothing when you're handed a VPAT and are told, hey, fill this out. We need your ACR. Again, so there's no particular requirements, but the more familiar someone is with accessibility, the better they're going to be able to fill out the ACR. And if you do it anyway without getting that additional training or knowledge, and it turns out your ACR is incomplete or worse, inaccurate, you can actually create liability for yourself because you've made a false report. You can lose contracts because if you win that contract because they looked at your ACR and you said you were conforming, and then a couple months down the line, it turns out that your product is not going to work out for them because it isn't accessible, then you're going to lose the contract. You're going to lose that business. What about third-party additions? Many times you've built a website or a digital property, but you're used additions that weren't built by you or your staff, your technology team. So, for example, a lot of websites use payment gateways that are out of their control, whether it's PayPal, Stripe, or other types of payment gateways, or you're using some sort of course membership site addition. That's something that you're not managing, but you've contracted with another party to do it for you. You're still responsible for that accessibility of the third party add-on. It's different if a third party posts something like a comment on your website where you have no control over that kind of thing. But if you've actually taken the time to decide, I want to use this gateway and I've integrated it into my website, then that becomes your responsibility. And if that gateway is not accessible, that becomes an issue. You're going to actually have to report on the conformance of that part of your website on your ACR. And you would want to put in your remarks why you chose to use that third party add on if you know that it doesn't fully conform to the standard. You may want to include, for example, you understand that it's not conforming, but you've gone to the third party, you've questioned them about addressing the accessibility issue, and maybe they've told, okay, we weren't aware of that, we're going to work on it. So you can say, hey, I know that I have this thing, it's not quite there yet, but I've spoken with the third party and they are working on making that product accessible. And that's the reason I'm submitting it now, even though it's not quite there yet. However, if you've gone to the third party and it turns out they have no idea what accessibility is and they don't care about it, then it's likely that you're probably going to have to say in your remarks that you're looking for a new vendor and you haven't identified them yet. But once you do, you'll switch it out or whatever. So basically, third parties additions to your website are still your responsibility. So you have to address why you're using that third party add-on if it's not in conformance and what you're going to do about it to get it into conformance, whether the third party is working on it or whether you're looking for another vendor. And you may want to consider looking for the other vendor first before you do your submission of your ACR, if there is time to do that. Again, it really depends on the deadline of when you're expected to submit the ACR. And just to start looking in the final segment, we're just going to look at the actual VPAT. So we went to the ITI website and downloaded the actual VPATs, and we're just going to take a look at them. So you can see that we have downloaded all of them. There's the EU version, the international version, WCAG, and the Section 508, and then the change tracking document. When you open up a view of that document, it's going to tell you again what version it is. And we know that this was developed in November of 2023 from the website. And it's going to tell you we've provided in multiple versions. And which one is this one? It's going to tell you this is the WCAG edition of the VPAT. And this is what it includes. So this one includes this one includes 2.0 guidelines, 2.1 guidelines, and 2.2 guidelines. And these are hyperlinks, so they link to those guidelines if you're unfamiliar with them, so you can go directly to the guidelines to study them. And then if you're on the wrong one, it'll refer you to the web page again, so you can download the right one. And it does give more explanation about the VPAT here. And then it gives you what to do before you start. And then it gives you requirements. This is a good section to review, which is what is the content minimum that you need. So the content minimum is that you need title, what template you're using, the product, the version of the product being reported on, the date, the description, the contact information. So if they have follow-up questions, they need to know who to contact, and listing an email is enough. And if there's any notes or additional information that you're trying to provide, and what you are using to evaluate so that they know what you did to complete the VPAT, the standards that are being used, and this says these are the standards we're showing. And then again, what are the conformance levels that you can use? We went over this: supports, partially supports, does not support, not applicable, not evaluated. And then we have the success criteria, the level A and triple. So while this is the version that has 2.0, 2.1, 2.2, if you're only reporting on 2.0, then you can remove the rest. It depends on who you're filling it out for and what they require. And then what's Other best practices they would say are to include your branding. If you're doing a revision, you should note date changes, version tracking. If there's any legal disclaimer that needs to be placed within any document for your company. This is meant to be comprehensive, but if it's not applicable, for example, Chapter 4 has to do with hardware. If your product is only software, and it would be acceptable to remove this entire section for it. Again, a card reader with no sound, you can remove the section about closed captioning technology. They accept translation of other languages. And then multiple reports. If you're creating an ACR for a complex product, sometimes you would want to separate answers into multiple products, multiple reports to address different parts of the product. And then there's a kind of a check. So a checklist at the end to make sure you did include all of this stuff in your report. And here's where it shows you the tables. Now, just so you know, these are all templates that are created in Microsoft Word. So I know not everybody uses Microsoft Word, but the templates were provided in Microsoft Word. And so so now we have the different tables. So the tables, these are the level A criteria. These are the level AA criteria. And these are the level A criteria. And because when the WCAG was developed, it was backwards compatible. When 2.1 was released, it included all of 2.0, et cetera, et cetera. So certain things are only applicable to the later standards. So for example, character key shortcuts is only something that is for 2.1, 2.2. So what they have done is put all of the A criteria in one table, but it's a mix of 2.0 and 2.1 and 2.2. But they will say when 2.1 and 2.2 are applicable. And then this is good to know. Certain criteria was actually removed with later versions. So for example, parsing was included in WCAG 2.0 and 2.1, but was removed as obsolete in 2.2. That's why this answer here just says supports, and you don't have to worry about it. And these all link to the web page to explain that criteria. So if you've never read the WCAG and you're asked to fill it out and you're not sure what's going on, these will link to the thing so that you can read more about that and then decide whether your product meets that. And while it links to the original guidelines, so these are the WCAG guidelines, there is also a website called Understanding WCAG, the understanding docs. So these are written in plainer language to explain some of the things that may come off as somewhat technical to people. So although the templates themselves link to the original criteria, you may want to Google the understanding documents that explain things, I think, in plainer language to people, so you can decide whether your product meets that standard easier. So that's the WCAG version. If we look at the 508 guidelines, you can see the main difference between the 508 and the WCAG is that 508 was basically based on the 2.0 guidelines, not 2.1, 2.2. They haven't yet updated the 508 guidelines. You'll find that you really only have to explain the 2.0 level A, and then level AAA language. So the tables are slightly different because really this is more for WCAG 2.0. And then for government vendors, often you're dealing with hardware, not just software. So they have a whole section about hardware and the guidelines that you need to deal with regards to the hardware. Again, you can link to the page that explains, let's see, what is the guide for display screens? What are you required? So you need to have 408 compliant display screens. And this kind of shows an illustration of what they're expecting for that kind of hardware. All the documents will link to that criteria. And then you have software again, and then documents. And then if we look at EU guidelines, so with the EU EN 301549, that kind of encompasses 2.1 WCAG, and then they have particular accessibility requirements more for like hardware technology kind of things. Because the EAA addressed a lot more than just digital web products or other things that they were dealing with. So the tables that are used in these are slightly different. So that's just to understand. So that's why it's important to know what criteria you're trying to follow, because your tables that you're going to need to fill out to say whether it conforms or not are going to be slightly different depending on which template you use. And these are with the EN 50549, you have to also put in functional performance statements. And again, this has to do with hardware type of products. So if this is not applicable to you because you're not dealing with hardware, you would say no. Not applicable. So again, like they're dealing with broader than just the average web page. They're also dealing with emergency service access. These are hardware that have to do with communication devices, video capable devices, two-way communication devices. So the 301549 comprises a lot more than just the WCAG. And then the international edition, again, different countries require different things. So if you're outside of the EU, you're outside of the United States, they basically have all of these things in here because they're not sure what the country needs specifically. And the tables be different, and you have to just find out exactly what it is that country requires. And you can adjust these tables based on what is actually needed and whether it applies to your digital property. So in the beginning, again, we go through the WCAG success criteria. And then they included the functional performance criteria, and they included the hardware criteria, the software criteria, the performance statements in the European model. So it's kind of has all the different tables in it. So again, it really depends on which country you're dealing with and what they require. And some will require only 2.0 because a lot of countries haven't updated themselves to 2.0. It was only actually with the release of Title II guidelines that we moved to 2.1 this year here in the United States for state and local government, where they actually said WCAG 2. So not everybody is as fast to move to the new guidelines. And then the change tracking document will just basically explain how they've revised the document so you can keep up on what the changes are. So the next time you need to do this, if you came in on file version 2.5 and 5 years from now you have to do it again, you can understand what were the changes made to the template so that you understand what is different or new and how best to make your new reporting easier on you because you understand what's new in the document. So the ITI does a good job with educating people about how to use their products. they have the templates, they have the training, and their templates link to the actual guidelines. And these are some 508 standards. And then while not directly linked, I would familiarize yourself with the WCAG understanding documents because they are helpful to understand the different criteria in a less technical way. And that'll help you decide whether your product meets this. So that's where we are with understanding VPAT. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Designers Learn Code, and we'll address any of your questions about VPAT. And then next time, we'll go back and look at this from the other side, which is what if you're evaluating somebody else's ACR for your company? Because now we've talked about it. If you're going to use a third-party addition to your website, you may want to request an ACR from that product that you want to add to your website. And now that you've received someone's ACR, how do you use that information to help you decide whether that product is right for you? So that'll be on the next episode.